On this day in history, July 29th, 1567, the infant James VI is crowned King of Scotland at Stirling. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. James I, born 1566, died 1625, King of Great Britain and Ireland, and James VI of Scotland, the only child of Mary Queen of Scots and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was born in Edinburgh Castle on June 19, 1566. He was proclaimed King of Scotland on July 24, 1567, upon the forced abdication of his mother, but was kept in the castle of Stirling for safety's sake amid the confused fighting of the early years of his minority until 1578. He was a weakly boy, and although he lived until he was nearly 60, he was never a strong man. James was brought up by the Earl and Countess of Mar. When the Earl died in 1572, his place was well filled by his brother, Sir Alexander Erskine. The king's education was placed under the care of George Buchanan, assisted by Peter Young, and two other tutors, who gave the boy a sound training in languages and in theology. The scholastic quality of his education helped to give him a taste for learning, but also tended to make him a pedant. James was only 12 when the Earl of Morton was driven from the regency, and for some time after he can have been no more than a puppet in the hands of intriguers and party leaders. The so-called Raid of Ruthven in 1582 was in fact a kidnapping enterprise carried out in the interest of the Protestant party. It was not indeed till 1583, when he broke away from his captors, that James began to govern in reality. His work can be divided into the part which was a failure and a preparation for future disaster, and the part which was solid achievement, honorable to himself and profitable to his people. His native kingdom of Scotland had the benefit of the second. Between 1583 and 1603 he reduced the anarchical baronage of Scotland to obedience, and replaced the subdivision of sovereignty, which had been the very essence of feudalism, by a strong centralized royal authority. In fact, he did in Scotland the work which had been done by the Tudors in England, by Louis XI in France, and by Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. But James not only brought his disobedient and intriguing barons to order, but also quelled the attempts of the Protestants to found what Hallam has well defined as a Presbyterian Hildebrandism. He enforced the authority of the state over the church, both before his ascension to the throne of England, 1603, and afterwards he took an intelligent interest in the prosperity of his Scottish kingdom, and did much for the pacification of the Hebrides. James's methods of achieving ends in themselves honorable and profitable have made posterity unjust to his real merits. He boasted of his kingcraft, and probably believed that he owed it to his studies. But it was in reality the resource of the weak, the art of playing off one possible enemy against another by trickery. The Marquis de Fontenay, the French ambassador, who saw him in the early part of his reign, speaks of him as cowed by the violence about him, and the terror in which he passed his youth sufficiently explains his preference for guile. He would make promises to everybody, as when he wrote to the Pope in 1584 more than hinting that he would be a good Roman Catholic if helped in his need. His very natural desire to escape from poverty and insecurity of Scotland to the opulent English throne led him to behave basely in regard to the execution of his mother in 1587. Taking good care to do nothing to offend Elizabeth, his crafty methods did him harm in England, where his reign prepared the way for the Great Civil War. In his southern kingdom, his failure was complete. Although England accepted him as the alternative to civil war, and received him with fulsome flattery, he did not win the respect of his English subjects. His undignified personal appearance was against him, and so were his garrulity, his Scottish accent, his slovenliness, and his toleration of disorders in his court, and his favor for handsome male favorites. In ecclesiastical matters, he offered many who contested his severity and rudeness to the Puritan divines at the Hampton Court Conference, 1604, with his politeness to the Roman Catholics. In a country where the authority of the state had been firmly established, and the problem was how to keep it from degenerating into the mere instrument of a king's passions, his insistence on the doctrine of divine right aroused distrust and hostility. though the doctrine had originated in a necessary assertion of the independence of the state in face of the Hildebrandism of Rome and Geneva alike. James's favor for his countrymen helped to defeat his wise wish to bring about a full union between England and Scotland. His profusion kept him assiduous, and drove him to shifts. Posterity can give him credit for his desire to forward religious peace in Europe, but his Protestant subjects could not see the consistency of a king who married his daughter Elizabeth to the Elector Palatine, a leader of the German Protestants, and also sought to marry his son to an Infanta of Spain. The king's subservience to Spain was indeed almost besotted, and allowed him to be befooled by the ministers of Philip III and Philip IV. The end of his scheming was that he was dragged into a needless war with Spain by his son Charles and his favorite George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, just before his death on March 27, 1625, at his favorite residence, Theobald's. James married in 1589 Anne, second daughter of Frederick II, King of Denmark, by whom he had 3 children who survived infancy: Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died in 1612, Charles, the future king, and Elizabeth, wife of the Elector Palatine Frederick V. Not the least of James's many ambitions was the desire to excel as an author. He left a body of writings which, though of mediocre quality as literature, entitle him to a unique place among English kings since Alfred for width of intellectual interest and literary faculty. His efforts were inspired by his preceptor George Buchanan. His future work was a youthful production in verse, Essays of Apprentice in the Divine Arts of Poesy, Eden Vautrolier, 1584, containing 15 sonnets, and metaphorical invention of a tragedy called Phoenix, a short poem of time, translation from De Bartus, Lucan, and the Book of Psalms, out of Tremellius, and a prose tract entitled An Short Treatise, containing some rulis and cautelus, to be observant and esquit in Scottish poesy. This tract shows acquaintance with the critical reflections of Ronsard and Du Bellay, and of Gascoigne in his Notes of Instructions 1575. In 1591, James published poetical exercises at vacant hours, including a translation of the Furies of Du Bartas, his own Lepanto, and Du Bartas's version of it, La Lepanthe. His Demonology, a prose treatise denouncing witchcraft and exhorting the civil power to the strongest measures of suppression, appeared in 1599. In the same year, he printed the first edition, 7 copies, of the Basilicon Doron, strongly Protestant in tone. A French edition, specially translated for presentation to the Pope, has a disingenuous preface explaining that certain phrases, e.g., papistical doctrine, are omitted because of the difficulty of rendering them in a foreign tongue. The original edition was, however, translated by order of the suspicious Pope and was immediately placed on the index. In his famous Counterblast to Tobacco, published anonymously, 1604, James forsakes his Scots tongue for Southern English. James's prose works, including his speeches, were collected and edited, folio 1616, by James Montague, Bishop of Winchester, who also translated them into Latin in 1619, also Frankfurt 1689. The True Law of Free Monarchies appeared in 1603, an Apology for the Oath of Allegiance in 1607, and a Déclaration du Roi Jacques pour la droit des rois in 1615. In 1588 and 1589, James issued 2 volumes of meditations on some verses of A. Revelations and B. 1 Chronicles, and 2 other meditations were printed posthumously.